He is surely the most powerful orator of our time. He's also a pretty fine writer. These, I think, have to be added to any notion of capital, social or otherwise.
Yeah, for sure.
That needs to be spelled out. I mean, it's an absolutely riveting speaker.
Yes.
The other part of that phrase, voice of reason, is what is the reasoning and how does it connect? That also needs to be spelled out. You talked at other points about common sense. But the notion of reason and common sense has to do with Pearson's arguments, terms and evidence somehow connecting with preconceptions in the audience with which these gel resonate. So that also needs to be worked through, both in terms of the public policy people, in politicians and bureaucrats, and also the wider community. What is it that he's saying that resonates with them? And this raises questions about the extent to which he's pushed an agenda, which he sometimes argued, as against the way he's connected with agendas and ways of seeing that are already pre-existing.
Okay, thanks, Murray. I think I've failed here because when I talk about Pearson as the voice of reason, I think what I've tried to do here is not to roll out a whole lot of theory, but when I talk about that common sense thing and being the voice of reason, I'm talking actually in theoretical terms about hegemony. So what that kind of neoliberal paradigm does is basically obscure other points of view. So it rolls out this idea that the market is the solution, and people like Nick Couldry start to talk about how it actually becomes almost impossible to think outside of neoliberalism. So when I talk about the voice of reason, I'm not actually really talking about the content of what Pearson has to say. I'm talking about his position how he's positioned in the field, and how that voice blocks other narratives from view. So that there is a full paper, and we have written a couple of papers about this. So
to the second part of the question is that we have actually gone through every one of those 137 invited columns, and they do lay out very, very clearly what I think there was one of the slides there had so agendas like mobility. So the idea that
goes to liberal discourse.
yes, it does.
So that only people who are willing to move out of disintegrating communities.
Yeah, but the problem is common sense or reasonable is highly problematic, and certainly contemporary with the Aboriginal community and
I don't
beyond.
think it's common sense in the same way.
Well, but I want to know what this term common sense or reason actually means, except reporting, as you did, that yes, that's common sense, said someone. But that raises the question, what's going on here?
Well, what's going on there is a media representation, and so that's presented as the sensible thing. I go out to northeast Arnhem Land and sit down with some Yolngu people who say to me, my work was around bilingual education. We don't speak English at home. The only people that speak English are the school teachers in the school. We send our children to school, and they fail because the teacher's talking to them in English. We want them to be taught in Yolngu Mata because they can understand when the teacher says sit down and listen, let alone A, B, C, D. And I think, gee, that seems like just common sense, because if I've got a child and I send it off to school and the teacher's talking in Korean, and we don't talk Korean at home, they're not going to hear Korean in the street, in the shop. They're not going to hear Korean. So I don't want to send my kid to school and it's got to speak Korean. Now, I think that's just common sense.
But someone might say that.
But Noel Pearson says send them to school and they must learn in English because they have to. And both of those narratives, there's a debate. That's great. I'm all for that kind of thing. But the people reading, the news, the people hearing even, my research would say hearing the ABC and Darwin coverage of this debate around bilingual education, don't get to hear that Yolngu woman talking about the problems. But that's common sense too. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that one voice gets anointed. One point of view gets presented. We miss out on that diversity of views. And so, yes, when I go to a party, the person I'm talking to hasn't heard that that Yolngu person talking about the problem, but yes, they've heard Noel Pearson talking about it. Of course people need to participate in the economy. It just makes sense. I don't know whether that's helping anybody, but that's, you know, there are different realities, and a good newspaper or a good media will present all of those, and we will have a good public debate. Our work says we've got a very narrow public discussion happening around Indigenous affairs.
That's one proposition, but the notion that what someone says who's the dominant person resonates as common sense does not follow automatically from the fact that they're the only voice heard. What we're hearing, I mean, it may be the case that that's the only reason that people have got for accepting this, but they may bring other things to this listening.
Okay, so the other part of the research is around the policymakers and what they're hearing and what they're listening to. And, you know, particularly in this period leading up to 2007, it's very clear that they're listening and accepting and understanding on the same wavelength. I think, you know, credit rating, I think you've probably said it all, to this same agenda, particularly at that point.
But you can imagine someone like Pearson, a figure like that, run a completely different agenda about what the Australian would call Aboriginal separatism, and the audience, maybe they're hearing this predominantly, saying this is bullshit. The last thing Aboriginal people need is to be treated as...
You can imagine, but you wouldn't have heard, you didn't hear that. There are other people out there saying that.
Views. That's why you don't hear it.
I can see what
That's
you're
when
getting
people say
at,
common sense. He's with me. Anyway.
I'll take direction from... We're running. Graham and I think Sylvia, perhaps.
Sylvia? It's a pretty simple question. I wondered whether you would take an account of the registration of Pearson and indeed another prominent leaders in the Aboriginal press itself, in the Cooley, the National Indigenous Times, which is the best known ones that we can get in, a few Sydney news agents and a few smaller Aboriginal newspapers in English, which is scattered around regional Australia. I find them extremely useful in keeping me, there's some concerns with First Washington Indigenous affairs. So utterly different registrations of these persons and other personalities and the way the government is funding Aboriginal policies over time. They've been around in the city news quite a while. And I think that's important because it's not pushed by anti-racist, well-intentioned people, white folk like them. You have knowledge on the ground that I don't have, although I go to Central Australia and the territory for it too. But I'm just asking whether you've taken some account of those Aboriginal perspectives on the identity.
No, we haven't. We did, and our project didn't. We touched on it and we came across people and we engaged, but it wasn't central. But that's what we're working on right now.
And well, I suppose we didn't document that as in do content analysis of what was being said, but we have done extensive interviews with a range of particularly Indigenous activists and certainly, and as Lisa said, this is where our research is heading. I suppose I'll just come back to the point that in the interviews with policymakers, they never mention Indigenous people. They don't read it, they don't listen to it. And so...
Yes, absolutely.
We also are hoping, we want to test or go a little bit further and find out whether the change in the media landscape, the proliferation of voice through Twitter, which Aboriginal people like to embrace, and other forms of social media, might actually have
also here.
Yeah, sorry, Sylvia, I'll just take one more question because we're nearly 20 minutes over time, and then we better wind up. You're right? Sorry, I think we better wind up. Yes. Thanks very much, Lisa.
My pleasure.
Challenges, innovations, solutions. This is APAC, Australia's public affairs.